Hi, my name is Natalie Sutton, and I'm going to talk about a social media campaign I've been working on that's focusing on how we can reform North Carolina prisons. And to start with that, we're going to really look at this recent repeal of the Racial Justice Act of 2009, what that means, what that's going to look like, the history of the act, all of that. And just kind of looking at ways that we can ensure that we're upholding values of justice and equality within our criminal justice system. Specifically when it comes to racial bias and how that influences sentencing, judicial processings in general, fair trials, things like that, and how we can fight against these unjust processes that are currently in place. So to start, let's take a look at the HK&J's 14-point agenda. As you can see, item 9 focuses on prison reform in North Carolina, and there are a lot of action steps listed which emphasize different ways that we can work towards prison reform. Some of these steps include looking at alternative sentencing programs besides prisons, helping smooth the transitions from prison to society, looking at ways to empower inmates, strengthen communities, and emphasize rehabilitation and growth as opposed to punishment and oppression. But the very first item on this list talks about rejecting the efforts to repeal the Racial Justice Act. So this is going to be my focus for this campaign. Before we get into that, however, I'd like to start with a seemingly simple and clear point, which is our criminal justice system is racially biased. I really want to let that sink in before we move on because it's really essential that people understand and accept this reality because that's what it is. It is a reality, and not everyone seems to understand that. So as you'll learn from this presentation, there are actually facts, statistics, and research to back up this sentence. So I'm going to say it one more time because it's really kind of the basis of my campaign, which is our criminal justice system is racially biased. All right, so first, what is the North Carolina Racial Justice Act? Well, it was an act passed that allows for those who are sentenced to death to challenge these sentencing decisions if they believe that race could have influenced their sentencing. It allows for statistical analysis and facts to prove that race does indeed matter for their specific case and for a lot of other cases throughout the area and throughout history that were similar. And the act's purpose was to prevent defendants from receiving the death penalty based on their race, which we are going to talk about more as the presentation goes on. Now a little bit about the history of the act. In 2009, it was passed to prevent death sentencing where racial bias is at play. In 2011, the North Carolina Senate passed a bill to repeal this act due to pressure from 43 district attorneys who claimed that the act had clogged the court system in the state. Senate passed a bill that November of 2011 that would have repealed the act, but the then governor, Bev Perdue, vetoed the repeal, stating that the court system was no place for racial bias. Then in 2012, the North Carolina General Assembly passed a major revision of the law in 2012, like I said, which was authorized by Paul Stam. These revisions significantly limited the use of statistics to only the county or district where the crime happened instead of the whole region or the state. So that really limited what statistics and information the courts were able to pull to use for these cases. These revisions also said that stats alone weren't enough to show bias and that race of the victim shouldn't be considered when revisiting these cases, which is important as we'll touch on later. Anyway, so okay, so now that you understand all this, why does this repeal matter? So a long comprehensive study conducted by researchers from Michigan State University and other similar studies conducted in North Carolina and other southern states have shown racial bias in jury selection and racial bias in prosecutors' charging decisions and jury sentencing. That's a lot of bias at a lot of different levels for court hearings. For jury selection, the MSU study found significant evidence that North Carolina prosecutors select juries based on their race. Prosecutors use peremptory strikes to remove capable and qualified African American jurors more than 2 times than the amount of times that they excluded white jurors. Of the 159 inmates on death row in North Carolina, for instance, 31 were sentenced by all white juries and 38 had only one minority on their sentencing juries. So you're really seeing this kind of, not a racially diverse juries at all, and that it can affect the outcomes of those trials. So for racial bias in decisions in sentencing, the study found that those who kill white people are more likely to receive the death penalty than those who kill African American people. So, looking at numbers, a defendant is 2.6 times more likely to get capital punishment if their victim is white. So the numbers on this slide are pretty shocking, I think. Look at the likelihood of lifetime imprisonment for people. That's what we're looking at here, and it's based on gender and race. So if you're a black man, for example, you have a 1 in 3 chance of being imprisoned for life, compared to 1 in 17 for a white man or 1 in 6 for a Latino man, which that's pretty huge. Additionally, if you look at the stats on women, as a white woman, 1 in 111 white women will be sentenced to life in prison, compared to being a black woman where your chances increase exponentially with a 1 in 18 serving out lifetime sentences. And then also as a Latino woman, it's increased compared to a white woman with 1 in 45 having lifelong sentences. So this says a lot about our criminal justice processing in this country, and North Carolina also reflects this trend, as we'll see, which is pretty terrifying. All right, so this whole issue of mass incarceration, or some are calling it the new Jim Crow, it could possibly be one of the biggest civil rights issues of our time today. So listen to this. More black men are in prison today than were enslaved at the start of the Civil War. And, the problem is not just once people get into the court systems, the problem starts before they even get in court, and then continues once they are arrested, and then it doesn't end once they're actually let back into society. So, black Americans, first of all, are far more likely to be arrested than white Americans to begin with. Then, people of color make up 30% of the country's population, but a whopping 60% of the prison population. So they're disproportionately represented in prison. Then, on top of that, black defendants receive harsher and longer prison sentences than their white counterparts. And it doesn't stop there. A study at the University of Wisconsin found that 17% of white job applicants with criminal records received callbacks from employers, compared to only 5% of black applicants with criminal records who received callbacks. In fact, the study found that race is so prominent that white people with criminal records actually received better treatment than the people of color without criminal records in this study. Okay, if you still think that race doesn't matter when it comes to our criminal justice system, and I'm emphasizing the word justice here because it's kind of ironic because there clearly isn't any in our current system, then take a look at these facts on the next slide. The U.S. Sentencing Commission reported in 2010 that in the federal system, black offenders receive sentences that are 10% longer than white offenders for the same exact crimes. Mark Maurer of the Sentencing Project reports that African Americans are 21 times more likely to receive mandatory minimum sentences than white defendants, and 20% more likely to be sentenced to prison in general than white drug defendants. Basically, the longer the sentence administered, the more likely it is that a person of color is the one receiving it. The Sentencing Project also found that 2/3 of the people in the U.S. with life sentences are people of color, and in New York it's actually 83%. These numbers are huge. Really think about what they mean, the lives they represent, the implications of all of this. North Carolina prisons reflect this larger national problem. So let's go ahead and take a look at this chart. This chart is from North Carolina's Department of Corrections. As you can see, 57% of our prisoners are African American here in North Carolina, and the most common offense is drug possession, which goes back to the study I was just talking about, which reflected on how people of color are disproportionately more likely to receive longer, harsher sentences for drug crimes than white people. All right, so it's always important to look at both sides of an issue and to try and figure out where people are coming from. So why would some people vote to repeal Racial Justice Act? So according to my research, Pat McCrory and many others who support repealing the act think that it is an act that is ultimately trying to ban capital punishment in North Carolina, which is something they oppose. It has also been cited that this act has just created a judicial loophole for prisoners, and that, according to McCrory, nearly every person on death row, regardless of race, will appeal their death sentence because of this act. McCrory cites that this act is more of a tool to avoid punishment and less of a tool to achieve justice. And some of its other opponents call it unnecessary and excessive. And, that's really because many people believe that we live in a post-racial society where race no longer influences people's experiences or decisions in court, things like that. So for those who do support the Racial Justice Act, they argue that it does not, in fact, illegalize capital punishment in North Carolina. And it has been shown that when it was in effect, it resulted in at least 4 convicts being taken off death row due to race unmistakably influencing the court's decision. So, think of all the other potentially mis-sentenced inmates because of their race. Supporters also explain that repealing the act ignores the history of and continuation of racism in the U.S., and more specifically North Carolina. Supporters also believe that the act has good intentions of promoting justice and equality in our legal proceedings, ensuring fair trials and sentencing, and that this could all help reduce the longer and harsher sentences that we see are given to people of color at an alarmingly disproportionate rate. All right, so I know all of this information can be a little overwhelming, a little disheartening. So, now that you see how pervasive and important this issue is, what can you do with all of this information? For one, you can get involved. This means you can go to the HKNJ website, familiarize yourself with the upcoming events and marches, mark them on your calendar, connect with people involved with organizing HKNJ events, and learn more about how you can help. Another thing you can do is donate. There's a link on the HKNJ website that lets you donate money to the cause, which is awesome. If you're unable to give money, which I totally understand, you can always give your time, which is arguably more important anyways. Figure out ways you can contribute to the fight against the repeal. I also encourage you to learn more about the American Civil Liberties Union for North Carolina by going to acluofnorthcarolina.org. They have a lot of educational and volunteer opportunities for you to jump on, and they also have links that can tell you more about how to join and support the cause or donate. And another important thing is to remember that you have a lot of power as the constituent. So find out who your local representatives in government are. I've provided a link to make that pretty easy, and you can find all of their contact information there. So, don't hesitate to call, email, or go see them face to face. Let them know what matters to you as a citizen, and see if you can get them to also support the things that matter to you and other North Carolina citizens. Remember that they need your vote and support, and that it's really important to make your voice heard because your voice really actually does matter. And then the last thing is just stay connected. Use social media to your advantage here. Follow things like HKNJ and ACLU on Twitter, friend them on Facebook to stay up to date and really stay in the know about new events, new legislation, subscribe to emails, stuff like that. And then at a larger sense, really connect with your community. Talk to your neighbors, your friends, your family, other community members. Let them know that this matters a lot to you and see if it matters to them. And help them to stay connected to the issue, because that's really where the chance for social change is going to start, is within these kind of empowered, active, discussion-oriented communities. So, yeah. Thank you so much for your time. If you have any questions about any of this information, or about how to get involved, or any concerns about any issues I raised during my presentation, you can definitely contact me. I've given my email address for that. Yeah, so I hope to hear from you if you want to learn any more.